For years, Prince Harry remained protected by royal systems that had guarded generations of Windsors. Then, without warning, a document surfaced inside palace corridors, a royal letter carrying Prince William's authority. What appeared to be a routine administrative change quickly revealed itself as something far more explosive. Behind the formal language was a decision that could permanently redefine Harry's place within the House of Windsor. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Reports suggest the first whispers began with an unusual security review, the kind of quiet palace process that usually passes without attention. But this time, the silence around it felt different. Senior staff were reportedly called into urgent conversations, not for a ceremonial issue, not for a travel update, but for something tied to Windsor's security itself. And when Prince William's name began circling around the discussions, the atmosphere changed completely. This was no longer seen as a minor adjustment, it was seen as a signal. For years, Harry had lived in a painful space between royal blood and royal distance, no longer a working member of the monarchy, yet still forever connected to its name, its history, and its risks. But according to palace insiders, questions had begun to harden behind closed doors. How much access should remain? Which protections still applied? And where did family loyalty end when institutional trust was already fractured? The alleged letter, carrying William's authority, seemed to answer those questions with cold precision. Security officials were said to be quietly reassessing long-standing arrangements, reviewing old protocols that once treated Harry as part of the inner Windsor circle. The move reportedly unsettled those who understood what such protocols meant. They were never just about guards, routes, and private briefings. They were about belonging. They marked who was inside the protected wall of the monarchy and who stood outside it. That is why this reported decision felt so severe. It suggested that William, now increasingly seen as the firm hand behind the future crown, was willing to draw a line that emotion alone could not erase. And somewhere inside that decision was the weight of years, interviews, accusations, broken trust, public wounds, and private disappointments that had never fully healed. Palace aides may have tried to keep the language calm, but the meaning was anything but soft. A major decision, insiders suggest, had already been finalized before the world even heard the first whisper. But the letter itself was only the beginning because its contents revealed a far deeper fracture inside the royal family. To understand why this alleged letter caused such shock, one must first understand what Windsor security protocols truly represent. They were never just about protection. They were symbols of belonging, trust, and royal legitimacy. For decades, inclusion in these systems signaled membership within the monarchy's inner circle. Removing someone from them carried consequences far beyond security itself. Inside the House of Windsor, security has always carried a meaning deeper than guards at gates or names on confidential lists. It is a quiet language of status, a hidden system that tells courtiers, police officials, advisors, and family members who is trusted, who is protected, and who still stands close to the crown. Harry once lived at the heart of that world. As a senior working royal, his life was shaped by royal movements, official duties, protected travel, private briefings, and the invisible machinery that followed him from palace to palace. He was not simply guarded because he was famous. He was guarded because he represented the monarchy in public, carried its burden, and stood as part of its active future. That is why the alleged removal from Windsor security protocols felt so severe to those watching closely. It suggested not just a change in arrangement, but a change in meaning. After Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties, questions had already begun to gather like storm clouds. What protections should remain when the role no longer remained? What privileges should follow a prince who no longer served the institution in the old way? And how could the palace balance family ties with the hard rules of duty, risk, and public trust? For years, these questions appeared unresolved, buried under legal battles, emotional interviews, and carefully worded statements. But behind the calm palace language, the matter reportedly became increasingly difficult. Access to security systems can mean access to schedules, movements, routes, internal planning, and sensitive information. In royal life, such access is never casual. It is granted because the institution believes a person belongs inside the protected circle. So when reports suggested William had signed a letter removing Harry from all Windsor security protocols, the message felt cold, final, and deeply personal. It seemed to say that blood alone was no longer enough. Harry's past as a beloved prince, soldier, and working royal could not erase the questions created by his distance from the firm. And for William, now carrying more weight as the monarchy prepared for its next era, this may have been seen as a painful but necessary line. The shield that once proved Harry's place within Windsor now became the very symbol of how far he had moved from it. Yet, while the public focused on security, palace officials were reportedly worried about something far more sensitive: control. The reported decision did not emerge overnight. According to various royal commentators, it was the culmination of years of disagreements, interviews, memoirs, and public criticism that steadily widened the distance between Harry and the institution he once served. The controversy added another layer to a conflict that many believed would eventually force a reckoning. When Harry and Meghan first stepped back from royal duties, the palace tried to present the moment with measured words, careful phrases, and controlled emotion. But beneath that calm surface, something had cracked. Harry was no longer simply a prince trying to build a different life. He became a symbol of a painful question the monarchy could not avoid. How does an ancient institution protect itself when one of its own begins? Speaking from the outside? The interviews came first, then the accusations, then the memoir that reopened wounds the palace had tried to seal. Each public revelation seemed to deepen the private distance. William, once seen beside Harry as the other half of a beloved royal partnership, reportedly watched that bond become something far colder. The brotherhood that once carried public hope was slowly replaced by caution, silence, and guarded conversations. And inside palace circles, the concern was no longer just emotional. It became practical. Trust and confidentiality are not minor matters inside the royal world. They are the foundation of survival. Every meeting, every movement, every quiet arrangement depends on the belief that private matters remain private. Once that belief weakens, the entire system begins to tighten. Reports suggest that senior aides had grown increasingly uneasy about how much access Harry should still have to information connected to Windsor life. Not because he had stopped being family, but because he had stopped being part of the working machine that carried the crown forward. That difference mattered. It mattered deeply. As King Charles faced his own pressures and the monarchy entered a more fragile chapter, William's role became more visible and more forceful. He was no longer just the grieving brother or the cautious heir. He was becoming the future guardian of the institution, the man expected to make brutal decisions before they became public crises. And the more William stepped into that responsibility, the more the question around Harry became unavoidable. Could old privileges remain when old trust had been damaged? Could emotional history outweigh institutional risk? Palace. Insiders whisper that frustrations had built for months, perhaps years, until the issue was no longer whether action would be taken, but when. The alleged letter was not the spark. It was the result of a fire that had been burning quietly behind palace doors for far too long. Then came the meeting that insiders claim changed everything and set the stage for William's most decisive move yet. As King Charles faced ongoing health challenges, observers increasingly noticed a shift inside the monarchy. William was no longer merely preparing for future responsibility, he appeared to be exercising it. Reports suggest that behind closed doors, discussions were taking place about how to safeguard the institution during a period of uncertainty. And that uncertainty, according to palace whispers, changed the entire balance of power. Charles remained the sovereign, the man with the crown, the authority, and the final word. But illness has a way of forcing ancient systems to reveal who truly carries the weight when the pressure becomes unbearable. In that fragile space, William's presence reportedly grew stronger. He was not acting with open drama or public confrontation. His power moved quietly through meetings, advisors, reviews, and decisions wrapped in careful language. Yet the message was unmistakable. The future king was beginning to guard the future throne. Senior advisors were said to be backing firmer measures, not because they wanted a family war, but because they feared the cost of hesitation. The monarchy had already endured years of public wounds, repeated headlines, and private matters turned into global debate. To those inside the institution, the question was no longer whether the family could simply forgive and move forward. It was whether the crown could survive if old access remained untouched while old trust remained broken. William, shaped by duty and sharpened by disappointment, reportedly understood that emotional loyalty could not be allowed to weaken operational discipline. Palace systems exist to protect more than people. They protect movements, conversations, future plans, state relationships, and the inner rhythm of royal life. Once those systems become vulnerable, the entire institution becomes exposed. That is why internal reviews of royal procedures reportedly became more intense. Security channels, protocol lists, briefings, and access points were quietly examined, and Harry's name, still heavy with history, reportedly became one of the most sensitive questions on the table. This was where William's role became almost impossible to ignore. He was emerging not as a distant heir waiting politely in the background, but as the monarchy's chief strategist, the man expected to make choices that others feared to touch. For Charles, the issue carried pain. For William, it carried responsibility. And that difference mattered. One father might hesitate over a son. One brother might grieve over the past. But a future king must look beyond the wound and ask what happens if nothing changes. In that moment, the alleged letter became more than a document. It became a test of authority, a silent declaration that the next reign would not be built on uncertainty, blurred lines, or emotional exceptions. But once the alleged letter began moving through official channels, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Whispers quickly turned into panic among those following royal affairs. If the reported changes were genuine, they represented more than administrative housekeeping. They suggested that Harry's remaining ties to Windsor systems were being systematically reassessed. For some observers, it felt like the closing of a chapter that once seemed impossible to end. Inside palace circles, the alleged directive reportedly landed with the force of a sealed door. Staff who understood the weight of security language knew this was not a simple adjustment. It was not a minor correction buried in paperwork. It was the kind of move that reshapes how a person is treated inside an ancient institution. Suddenly, questions spread from private offices to royal commentators, from whispered briefings to global headlines. What exactly had been removed? How far did the order reach? And did this mean Harry's final operational links to the Windsor machine were being cut one by one? The speculation grew because the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Harry had already lost the daily role of a working royal. He had already stepped away from the rhythm of palace life, official duties, and public service under the crown. But security protocols were different. They were part of the hidden architecture of belonging. They suggested that, even from a distance, a person remained tied to the protected center. If those systems were now being reassessed, then the message was devastating. It suggested that the old bridge was no longer merely damaged, it was being formally narrowed. Royal correspondents began debating whether the decision was fair, necessary, or painfully excessive. Some saw it as William drawing a responsible boundary at a dangerous time for the monarchy. Others saw it as another sign of a family bond collapsing under the weight of public conflict. But to palace officials, the matter reportedly carried a colder logic. Security is not built on sentiment. It is built on trust, discipline, and control. If a person no longer serves the institution, if private matters have repeatedly become public battles, then insiders argue the system must protect itself before emotion weakens its walls. This is where Harry's symbolic status became the center of the storm. He remained royal by birth, but birth no longer guaranteed access. He remained connected by blood, but blood no longer restored confidence. And as the story spread beyond Britain, the debate became worldwide. Supporters questioned whether Harry was being punished for choosing independence. Critics argued that independence must also mean losing privileges linked to royal duty. Between those two views stood William's alleged letter, silent but powerful, carrying a message few could ignore. The monarchy was entering a new era, and in that era, old titles might remain, but old access could vanish. Yet the greatest impact may not have been practical, it may have been deeply personal. Security arrangements can be replaced. Titles can be debated. Public perception can change. But family relationships are far more complicated. According to many royal watchers, the reported removal carried a message that extended beyond logistics. It reflected how dramatically the relationship between two brothers had transformed over the years. William and Harry were once seen as inseparable symbols of resilience, two sons walking through public grief and growing into royal men under the eyes of the world. Their bond carried emotional weight because the public believed it had survived what few childhoods could survive. They laughed together, served together, appeared together, and for years, many imagined they would one day modernize the monarchy side by side. That memory is what makes the alleged letter feel so painful. It was not simply a future king making an institutional decision. It was one brother drawing a boundary around another, and boundaries inside royal families are never clean. They carry history, they carry loss, they carry every conversation that never healed. Over time, the relationship changed under the pressure of marriage, duty, resentment, public criticism, and private silence. Moments that might once have been handled behind palace walls instead became part of a global argument. Every interview, every accusation, every headline seemed to push the brothers further apart, until the old warmth was replaced by distance and suspicion. William reportedly became more guarded, not only as a brother, but as the heir responsible for protecting the crown. Harry, in turn, became a figure many viewed with sympathy and many others viewed with frustration, a prince caught between personal pain and public consequence. That is why reactions to the alleged removal became so divided. Some saw cruelty, others saw necessity. Some believed Harry had already paid a heavy emotional price for stepping away. Others argued that royal systems cannot remain open to someone who has chosen a life outside the working institution. But beneath those debates sat a quieter tragedy. The monarchy often turns family problems into constitutional questions, and once that happens, feelings lose their power. A brotherly wound becomes a file. A private disappointment becomes a protocol review. A broken relationship becomes language in a formal letter. That is the personal cost of royal disputes. The heartache is hidden beneath procedure, but it does not disappear. It hardens, it waits, and when the decision finally comes, it feels colder because it arrives wearing the mask of duty. For Harry, the alleged removal may have carried the sting of exclusion. For William, it may have carried the burden of command. Neither version is simple. Neither version is painless. And while attention focused on Harry, another question quietly emerged. What does this mean for the future monarchy? Every monarchy faces defining moments when tradition collides with modern reality. Many commentators believe this alleged decision represents one of those moments. It highlights a broader transformation occurring within the House of Windsor, a shift toward a smaller, more tightly controlled institution focused on survival in an increasingly skeptical age. For William, that future appears to demand discipline, caution, and a clear understanding of who truly serves the crown. The old model of royal life, where family connection could sometimes blur official boundaries, now seems to be giving way to something colder and more strategic. A streamlined monarchy cannot carry endless uncertainty. It cannot allow personal disputes to keep reopening institutional wounds. It cannot afford systems where access remains unclear, roles remain undefined, and public trust is constantly tested by private conflict. That is why this alleged decision, however painful, fits into a much larger pattern. William's long-term priority is not simply popularity. It is survival. He is reportedly looking toward a reign where the monarchy must justify every privilege, every protection, every cost, and every decision before a public that asks harder questions than ever before. In that kind of world, royal status alone may no longer be enough. Service, loyalty, discretion, and active duty become the real measures of belonging. The reported removal of Harry from Windsor's security protocols therefore becomes more than a family dispute. It becomes a warning about the shape of the next royal era. The institution appears to be learning from recent controversies with brutal clarity. Public interviews, legal battles, memoir revelations, and constant speculation have all taught the palace that loose ends can become crises. A single unresolved privilege can become a headline. A single unclear role can become a battlefield. And a single emotional exception can weaken the very structure William may one day inherit. Supporters of Harry may see this as harsh, even unforgiving, especially because the personal pain between the brothers remains so visible. But supporters of William may see it as necessary, the kind of uncomfortable leadership that protects the monarchy from slowly bleeding authority. This is the cruel tension at the heart of royal governance. The crown survives by placing institution above emotion, even when emotion is tied to family, childhood, and shared grief. The future House of Windsor may be smaller, quieter, and more carefully guarded. It may rely on fewer working royals, stricter access, tighter procedures, and sharper lines between private relatives and public representatives. And if this alleged letter truly reflects William's thinking, then the message is unmistakable. The next reign will not be built on sentiment alone. It will be built on control, discipline, and the firm belief that the monarchy must protect itself before it can protect anyone else. But before the story can truly be understood, one final question remains unanswered. In royal history, documents often outlive the people who sign them. Letters, decrees, and decisions become markers of turning points that reshape entire generations. Whether viewed as necessary leadership or heartbreaking division, the reported letter attributed to William has sparked a debate that reaches far beyond security arrangements and palace procedures. It has forced one of the oldest questions in monarchy back into the open. What matters more, duty or family loyalty? For some, William's alleged action represents the painful discipline of a future king who understands that the crown cannot survive on emotion alone. For others, it feels like another wound in a brotherhood already marked by distance, grief, and years of public conflict. That divide is exactly why the story has traveled so quickly. It is not only about Harry. It is about the future shape of the House of Windsor. Every royal decision carries a second life after the moment passes. It becomes part of the record, part of the memory, part of the quiet history that future generations study when they ask how the family changed. If this reported letter truly marked a turning point, then it may one day be remembered as the moment William began defining the rules of his own era before the crown ever touched his head. Harry's place remains uncertain, caught between bloodline and distance, between royal identity and life outside the working institution. He is still a prince by birth, still part of the family story, still tied to the tragedy, glamour, and burden of Windsor history. But symbolic closeness is not the same as operational trust. And that is the hard lesson at the center of this alleged decision. The public will continue to argue over whether the move was fair, cold, wise, or cruel. Supporters will see punishment. Critics will see consequence. Royal watchers will read every silence, every journey, every absence for hidden meaning. But inside the deeper story, the monarchy appears to be sending a message that is larger than one man. The next chapter will demand sharper boundaries. The old habit of leaving difficult questions half-answered may no longer be enough. William, carrying both personal pain and future responsibility, seems increasingly tied to a vision of monarchy where service matters more than sentiment. And access must be earned through trust. That is what makes the reported letter so powerful. It is not loud, it does not need to be. Its force comes from what it quietly suggests, that the Windsor world is closing ranks, protecting its center, and preparing for a future where family name alone may not open every door. Because in the end, the story was never simply about security protocols, it was about who belongs within the future of the monarchy and who no longer does. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.